You know what's funny about parenting? People think the big moments are what shape children. The graduation speech, the deep heart to heart talk, the dramatic life lesson after somebody sneaks out, fails math, or nearly sets the microwave on fire trying to make noodles at 2 a.m. But most children, they're shaped by the tiny sentences they hear so often that those words eventually become their inner voice. And after watching parents for decades, exhausted parents, loving parents, overwhelmed parents, parents one unpaid bill away from talking to the wall, I noticed something heartbreaking. A lot of children only hear from adults when they're doing something wrong. Clean that up. Stop arguing. Why are your grades dropping? What's wrong with your attitude lately? Meanwhile, the child is slowly building an identity out of correction, pressure, and disappointment. And then parents wake up one day confused because their teenager barely talks anymore, or because their sweet little kid suddenly acts irritated by oxygen itself. So, today, I want to talk about the three simple things you should say to your kids every single day. Not fake motivational nonsense, not cheesy parenting slogans from mugs designed by people who clearly have never met a middle schooler. I mean phrases that actually change how children behave, think, and emotionally survive growing up. It starts quietly, almost invisibly. Most parents don't wake up one morning and decide, today I will emotionally disconnect from my child. It happens in fragments. A rushed morning here, a stressful evening there, a phone buzzing during dinner, a tired sigh after work, a repeated sentence said without thinking. And slowly, the child learns a pattern. When I observe families, I often notice something that never gets written in parenting manuals. Children don't measure love in grand gestures, they measure it in emotional availability. If the most consistent interaction they have with an adult is correction, even gentle correction, their brain begins to prepare for it automatically. It's almost like their nervous system starts wearing armor before the conversation even begins. You can see it in small ways. A child walking into a room and immediately scanning the adult's face. A teenager answering questions with, I'm fine, before anything is even asked. A preteen becoming overly defensive about simple requests. People often label this as attitude, but psychologically, it's usually anticipation of judgment. There's something important here that most parents don't realize. The adolescent brain is not just growing intellectually, it's becoming extremely sensitive to social evaluation. Around the preteen years, children become hyper aware of tone, facial expression, and emotional signals, not because they are dramatic, but because their brain is literally training itself for independence and social survival. So, when a child repeatedly hears only functional communication, instructions, corrections, reminders, they start associating interaction with performance, not connection, performance. I once observed a boy around 12 who had become what many would call difficult. He wasn't aggressive, he wasn't rude in an obvious way, he was just absent. He would answer questions with the minimum effort required to escape the conversation. One word replies, shrugs, eye contact that lasted half a second too short. His parents described him as lazy, unmotivated, always on that phone or daydreaming. But what stood out to me was not his behavior, it was the emotional climate around him. Every interaction began with correction before curiosity ever entered the room. Did you do your homework? Why is your room like this? You forgot again. No malicious intent, just exhaustion layered over repetition. And here's the subtle shift that happens in a child's mind. If attention mostly arrives in the form of correction, then silence becomes safer than expression. Less talking means fewer mistakes. Fewer mistakes means fewer emotional consequences. So the child retreats, not physically, emotionally. And parents interpret that retreat as rebellion or laziness, when in reality, it is often emotional self protection. This is why the words spoken daily matter far more than the rare big conversations. Because the brain does not archive parenting advice like a lecture, It absorbs repeated emotional patterns like background programming. And once that pattern is set, it shapes everything: confidence, communication, motivation, even how the child views themselves when no one is watching. That's where the three daily phrases come in, not as magic words, but as emotional recalibration points that quietly reset the tone of the relationship before distance becomes permanent. Then there is something most parents underestimate. Children don't just need guidance, they need emotional confirmation that they still belong, even when they are not performing well. And that's where the first of the two daily phrases comes in: I'm glad you're here. It sounds almost too simple, doesn't it? Like something you would say absent mindedly when someone walks into a room. But psychologically, it carries a weight that many children rarely experience consistently. Because think about how most interactions begin in a typical household. A child walks in, and the parent's brain immediately jumps into management mode. What needs fixing? What's overdue? What went wrong today? Now compare that to a child who walks in and hears in a calm voice, I'm glad you're here. Nothing about performance, nothing about behavior, nothing about achievement, just presence being acknowledged. And presence is what children silently test for all the time, especially teenagers. Teenagers are interesting. They act like they don't care, but emotionally, they are constantly scanning for signs of acceptance. They may roll their eyes, sigh, disappear into their rooms, act like they are building a fortress of independence, but underneath that, their nervous system is still deeply wired for belonging. When that belonging feels conditional, they adjust, sometimes by withdrawing, sometimes by becoming defensive, sometimes by becoming overly agreeable outside the home and emotionally shut down inside it. Now, here's where it gets subtle. A child who rarely hears emotional welcome doesn't just feel unwanted, they begin to assume their presence is neutral or even inconvenient unless they are useful. So they start performing usefulness instead of building identity. They become the child who over explains everything, or undershares everything, or tries to predict every adult reaction before speaking. I remember observing a teenage girl in a household where she was academically strong, well behaved, and outwardly easy. But she had this habit of entering rooms quietly, almost apologetically, like she was checking whether her presence would disturb the emotional weather of the house. Her parents thought she was just well mannered, but what I saw was a child who had learned that neutrality was safer than visibility. And this is where the phrase, I'm glad you're here, becomes psychologically powerful. It interrupts that invisible calculation. It tells the child that presence itself is not a problem to be solved, not after performance, not after achievement, not after compliance, just presence. Now, the second phrase is even more important, especially in homes where achievement is a big focus, which honestly is most homes today. I love who you are, not just what you do. This one cuts deeper than people expect because it directly challenges one of the most common parenting traps: conditional approval disguised as motivation. Many parents believe they're encouraging excellence when they emphasize results: grades, discipline, achievements, behavior charts, responsibilities. And yes, structure is important. But when all emotional warmth becomes attached to outcomes, something subtle happens inside the child. They begin to believe that their worth is produced, not inherent. So they start chasing approval instead of building identity. A child in this pattern may become high performing, responsible, even impressive on paper, but internally, they often carry a quiet fear. If I stop performing, do I stop being valued? That fear doesn't always show up as sadness. Sometimes it shows up as perfectionism, sometimes as anxiety, sometimes as secrecy, because mistakes stop feeling like learning opportunities and start feeling like identity threats. I once observed a boy in early adolescence who was constantly praised for being the smart one. He performed well, answered quickly, stayed ahead in most tasks. But when he got something wrong, even something small, his reaction wasn't casual disappointment, it was tension, immediate withdrawal, almost like his identity had been questioned. That's what happens when doing becomes too tightly tied to being. So when a child hears consistently, I love who you are, not just what you do, it does something corrective. It separates identity from performance. It tells them your value is not on probation. And that separation is what builds emotional resilience. Because a child who feels secure in who they are can handle failure without collapsing internally. They can take feedback without interpreting it as rejection. They can improve without feeling erased. And once those two phrases are present in a child's daily emotional environment, I'm glad you're here, and I love who you are, not just what you do, you begin to notice something interesting over time. The child doesn't become perfect. They become safer, more open, less defensive, more willing to be honest. And honesty, in parenting, is often the first real sign that connection is working. Now we come to the phrase that most parents struggle with the most, not because it's complicated, but because it requires something many adults find uncomfortable in real time: emotional steadiness when things go wrong. We'll figure this out together. On the surface, it sounds like reassurance, but psychologically, it does something far more important. It removes isolation from the problem. Because for a child or teenager, mistakes rarely feel like events. They feel like consequences that define them. A failed exam doesn't just mean I didn't pass. It often translates internally into I am in trouble, or worse, I am disappointing. And when that emotional interpretation kicks in, the child doesn't think clearly anymore. The nervous system shifts into survival mode: fight, flight, or freeze. That's why you see teenagers shut down during conflict, or become defensive, or suddenly start lying even when honesty would actually help them. It's not always rebellion. It's often panic disguised as behavior. Now imagine two different responses to the same situation. A teenager comes home with a serious problem, maybe a broken phone, a failed test, or a mistake they're afraid to admit. In one household, the reaction is immediate escalation: questioning, frustration, disappointment, emotional distance. Even if no one is shouting, the emotional message is clear: you are on your own with this problem. In another household, the response is steady, even if disappointed. Okay, we'll figure this out together. Same situation, completely different emotional outcome. Because that second response does something critical. It keeps the parent present inside the problem instead of turning the problem into separation. This is called co-regulation in psychology. Children, especially younger adolescents, don't fully regulate emotions alone. They borrow emotional stability from adults around them. When the adult stays grounded, the child's nervous system gradually calms down enough to think again. But when the adult becomes emotionally escalated, the child doesn't learn responsibility. They learn emotional danger. I once observed a situation involving a teenager who had made a fairly significant mistake at school. Nothing catastrophic, but serious enough to require parental involvement. What struck me wasn't the mistake itself, it was how quickly the child's entire posture changed the moment the conversation began. Shoulders tight, eyes down, short answers. Not because the issue was unsolvable, but because the child had already assumed the emotional outcome: disapproval and distance. When a child expects emotional abandonment and conflict, honesty becomes risky. So they start managing perception instead of solving the problem. But when a parent consistently communicates, we'll figure this out together, something important shifts over time. The child learns that problems are not relational threats, they are shared tasks. That doesn't remove consequences, it doesn't erase accountability. In fact, it strengthens responsibility because the child is not distracted by fear of emotional rejection while trying to understand what went wrong. There is also another layer here that many people miss. This phrase teaches emotional endurance. Life will eventually teach every child that mistakes happen, systems fail, plans break, and decisions carry consequences. The question is not whether they will face problems, they will. The question is whether they will face those problems alone emotionally or with internal stability. And children who grow up hearing calm partnership language during difficulty tend to develop a very specific advantage later in life. They don't collapse under pressure as easily. They don't associate mistakes with identity failure. They don't panic as quickly when things go wrong. They solve. And they ask for help without shame. So when you put all three phrases together, I'm glad you're here, I love who you are, not just what you do, and we'll figure this out together, you are not just speaking to behavior. You are shaping how a child experiences belonging, identity, and crisis. Not perfectly, not instantly, but consistently enough that over time, the child stops living in emotional uncertainty and starts building something far more stable, internal safety. And that changes everything about how they grow up. If you strip parenting down to its most honest form, it's not really about controlling behavior, it's about shaping emotional memory. Years from now, children won't remember every correction, every lecture, or every don't do that again moment, but they will remember the emotional atmosphere they grew up in. Whether they felt welcomed, whether they felt valued beyond performance, and whether they felt supported when things went wrong. That's what these three phrases quietly build over time. I'm glad you're here builds belonging. I love who you are, not just what you do, builds identity security. We'll figure this out together builds emotional resilience. And when those three things are consistently present, something interesting happens. Children stop relating to their parents from a place of fear or performance and start relating from trust. Not because life becomes easier, but because it becomes emotionally safer to be honest inside it. Of course, no parent gets this perfect. No household is constantly calm or emotionally ideal. That's not the expectation. The real shift is intention, choosing to make these phrases part of the daily emotional rhythm, especially in the ordinary moments when nothing dramatic is happening, because that's where the real parenting happens, not in the crisis, but in the everyday sentences that quietly build a child's internal voice for life. If this made you reflect on your own experiences or how you communicate at home, I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. I do read them and I often respond when I can. And if you found this useful, like, share, and subscribe. It helps more people see content like this, and it keeps this conversation going because raising emotionally healthy children is something none of us should have to figure out alone.